All right, so now we are live, and I think we will start with this one here, which David can hopefully give us some more context on this. So we reviewed this last time with Jan Volicek, I think, and basically the questions that we had was, why is this thing needed, and why are these samples, because these samples talk about virtual functions and override behavior, but nothing here is really virtual, so it's a bit confusing in what this thing is supposed to solve.
Sorry, Emo, are you sharing a screen? I can't see it.
Oh, sorry, I do not share my screen because that would be useful, right? I mean, YouTube can see my screen. Okay, let me just click on this thing here. It is require method impl. I think that's the one. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Perfect.
All right, so I'm kind of hoping Jan would be able to show up, but he looks to be offline on Teams. I hope his internet is in good shape. But I can answer your questions really quickly. So this is a feature that is needed for the covariant returns feature, but is not exactly the same. So covariant returns has two basic things that happen when you use the feature. One is that via a method impl record, it's possible to override a method covariantly with a different return type. And the other one is it follows on from that as a request from the C# team that method impls have, that this sort of method impl has a slightly different behavior than a normal method impl. Method impl records, and the way they end up working with normal method impls is that they actually, you end up having multiple vtable slots, and it's possible to join and split various different sets of the vtable slots. And this is in contrast to the desired C# language level feature for covariant returns. So we came up with this attribute that changes the behavior of how method impls work. So this is it's use this attribute to change the behavior of how method impls work. Oh, and by the way, with covariant returns, method impls can be used to override something covariantly. So it takes both features together to get the C# language feature to work. And that's why this is actually, the examples are written in terms of sort of void returns to emphasize the idea that this is actually a feature that is technically independent of covariant return method impl behavior. But I did add another example in my comment down below of why this is important. Yeah, right there. So this is sort of written in pseudo C#ese, because this you can't actually write. The idea is, well, if you had a base type that defined a virtual method, then you overrode it on some derived type. We want it to not be possible to override things in the wrong way, which would otherwise work with a name and sig matching override. So it's about changing the way overrides work, and keeping all of the all of these names end up being forced to call the same method at each level of the hierarchy. So that was question one. Does that make sense to everybody as to why there's two different things here?
I have just one question on it. So the first behavior that you described, that can't match what C# wants because it's already existing and changing it would break. Is that right?
Yes, we do have, there are customers who use method impl records and rely on the current behavior of how method impls work. So just changing how method impls work is not something that the runtime team was comfortable with doing.
I know it's not exactly related to this attribute, but in the sample you have here, if this was delivered from 3 different assemblies, the runtime will handle it correctly, right?
Yeah.
In particular, test-derived 2 could have been built when test-derived 1 was not yet overriding the method and increasing the variance.
Right. I mean, yeah, you would have to build this with 3 different assemblies to get the C# compiler to do something like this. But assuming the presence of multiple assemblies and cross-assembly versioning, you could get into this sort of trouble.
Okay.
So that's what it's for. The next question was about naming. And I will admit that I am notoriously terrible at naming. And I think Fadi is only slightly better. And so we kind of put a name on it that made sense to us, with the hope that someone who knows about naming could help.
Yeah, so basically, so can you describe, like, what is the semantic of the attribute when you put it on a method? It basically says, first of all, like, if you try to override something, like if you override basically basically if you override the one that is like from like 3 up the hierarchy with the other return type, then that becomes an error.
Yeah, it's not just that it becomes an error. What it means is, as you do the overrides apply to all of the slots at once, and keeps them together. There's a single spot in the description of how this works in the ECMASpec, or well, in the runtime implementation of the ECMASpec. The actual ECMASpec documentation for this does not make it simple to identify the point in the spec which changes. We do need to actually get formal language written up for that, but it makes it so that when you override the base method, you actually also will be overriding the override in test class derived 1. And then because you are overriding test class derived 1 with something that doesn't meet the signature of test class derived 1, then you would get a type load exception. But what the attribute is actually doing is forcing the override of virtual methods.
So would it be reasonable to say that the attribute does something like override all compatible input signatures? Because where it's just ignoring the return type in signature matching?
But it doesn't actually, it's unrelated to the signature matching. It's simply related to the fact that the way the override is expressed via the method impl record. Because you don't actually, because the attribute isn't actually tied to covariant returns and all this other business, it's actually tied to the way the virtual method is expressed as a dot override and using a method impl record instead of a name and signature override where you simply have you mark the method as being virtual but not new slot, so it attempts to override something.
So maybe that's obvious to you, but like to me, it's like to me the vtable is just effectively an array of function pointers. So how do you know which ones belong together?
So there are 2 different entirely independent ways that overrides work for virtual methods in .NET. One way is, so there's the rule is if a method is marked as virtual, it has an entry, it goes into the vtable. If it is a new slot virtual, it always gets a new entry in the vtable. And if it's not a new slot virtual, it will attempt to find an entry which matches exactly by name and signature in a base type, and then go into that slot. Or if it cannot find an exact match in a base type, it will generate a new slot for it. And then once a method you have a method that is a virtual method, you can declare with a method impl record or in IL syntax a dot override keyword that this virtual table slot method should override the vtable, should replace the vtables, the contents of the vtable slot for another method. And that's the method impl style overriding. And what this attribute allows you to do is treat that method impl style overriding as more similar to normal vtable overriding, although in the context of the runtime, it's not exactly identical. It becomes it's still observable that there are multiple vtable entries in some ways, but not in ways that are directly tied to making function calls. It has to do with how overrides work.
What C# operations today or declarations today would generate the latter? Are there any?
If you have a class which derives from a class in a different assembly and has a finalizer, you will generate a method impl record to override the finalizer. And there's, I believe there's one other circumstances that was described to me once. It's incredibly rare. The other scenario where you'll see it more commonly is, I believe, Visual Basic doesn't do this. I think they thought about doing this, handling the case of because the name and sig match is actually case sensitive. There may have been languages that allow case insensitive overrides via a .override keyword. I was thinking that VB did that, but I believe actually they simply renamed the method for you to match the base method.
I see.
So most commonly we have seen it in the wild in terms of obfuscators, which, yeah, but there are obscure cases where this is existing method impl feature is used.
So then, when you said like they treat all the overrides together, then I guess the set is determined by going to a particular method and effectively walking the chain, right? Going to the override of the base and then walking its overrides, right? So, but a given method will only have a single override, right? They will not have multiple override keywords in IL, right?
It can. You can have as many as you'd like. And there are rules that describe exactly what happens. And this would be just declare that this attribute would declare that all the override keywords at a particular point have a specific behavior. Because in practice, while it's technically possible to have multiple overrides on a single method, it's incomprehensible.
But basically, the idea would be that this attribute would basically cover all the overrides in the current method plus the chain of the base calls, right? They would all be treating them as the same, and overriding would always happen together effectively.
Yeah.
So I assume it's not just name matching, that you're not splatting over the entirety of a method group for all of its overloads. So there must still be some sort of compatibility matching, or like how is it understanding what to override?
Oh, so .override, you declare this is the method that is doing the override, and this is the overridden method. And those are described via an exact name and signature match. So name and signature includes return types, parameter types, custom modifiers, name.
Right, but how does this attribute, or what is the runtime using in concert with this new attribute to know which other slots are also compatible?
Oh, so for the purpose of the covariant return feature, it is simply that a method impl override allows there to be a declared method and a body method, which don't have an exact name and signature match. It allows the signature to vary covariantly on return type, and nothing else. That's the only variance permitted.
Right. So is this attribute doing anything other than allow override with covariant return?
It isn't doing it does not actually change the covariant return behavior at all. It is not associated with covariant return in terms of its semantic in the runtime. What it's associated with is changing the rules about how method impl slots affected, vtable slots affected by method impls work in further derived types. So in the example here, the attribute would be on test class derived one.method and would change the behavior of the overriding that occurs within test class derived two.
So does the runtime actually care about covariance? Like basically, the way I understand it is that the override behavior is used by C# so that C# can tell you, yeah, override is other thing that has a different return type, because normally overrides are, as you said, signature, which means return type plus mod ops, plus modrex plus everything that they have as parameters, right? And do you actually validate that the return value is covariant on type load?
Yes. Yes, and that's done independent of all of this attribute entirely.
Right.
That's a separate concern. But yes, it does. I believe mono does not, but the courseular does.
All right. So this attribute being placed on test class derive one's override of method says that when the runtime loads test class derive two and it finds a new override, that it needs to it make that both an override for virtual slots. I'm going to say 6 and 7.
Sure. Yes.
Using loose hand wavy stuff, but that the compatibility, the way that it determines both 6 and 7 is by matching name and sig except return. Like how does the runtime know what all slots are affected? Is the question.
When test class derived 2 exists and its override kicks in. So we have this method which says I'm base type dot method on test class derived 2, and it does not. If, for instance, it does not have a method impl override, so it has a normal style override. That would follow the existing name and signature rules. That would say, oh, that should override test class with virtual method dot method, because that's an exact name and signature match. And that override would kick in as per normal, and then because there's also the dot override. That dot override would be applied to make sure that that test class derived 2 dot method also was overriding test class derived 1 dot method because of this attribute that we added. And then it would do a signature check there to verify that this is an acceptable override, and then that would fail. If, for instance, the test class derived 1 had was signature compatible but not name compatible, and so was therefore implemented via a dot method impl override with this attribute, then doing the override of the base type method would actually be permissible and would work and would override both the method impl, or both vtable slots for the most derived or base and derived classes.
I'm going to make a bold suggestion here, and that is there are several very smart people on this call being explained what this feature is eloquently by the foremost expert in what this feature is. We've been going for 30 minutes and still don't quite understand it. Therefore, no one's going to care, and we can pick whatever name we want.
Fair enough. Yeah, so my concern with the name is it sounds like it's related to linker trimming, with me not knowing anything. It sounds like this is important, don't throw it away, and we've taken a lot of stuff about trimming, and so it felt like it went in that bucket. So it'd be nice for it to, if this is describing what it's doing, then it's fine and probably doesn't matter.
Yeah. So the name preserve base overrides doesn't seem any more wrong than the name I came up with. It is what it is. So I'm happy to change the name there. I don't think it really matters. The other question that was involved here was, should we use a method impl flag? Honestly, it would be better to use a method attribute flag, except we don't have any in the metadata spec. We could put it as a method impl. That would probably be okay. It's not really what method impls are for, but
yeah, I was just asking because it seems like it's in the same bucket as some of the stuff that is on method impl, but like Jan didn't seem to like it, so a method attributes apparently we don't have any remaining bits left, so a custom attribute is fine.
Yeah, and nobody better use this thing directly because they're going to get in weird trouble. Fortunately, it'd be hard to actually get that into that situation because C# doesn't generate these attributes. Yeah, so that's the commentary I have.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. So then I would just say let's go with the, like, I know somebody has a problem. I personally just like preserve base overrides more because at least it tells me something, but the other one I literally don't understand what the name means. This one at least gives me some idea what the name might mean. But yeah, it's also not a mainline attribute, so nobody really cares that much, I guess.
Yeah, I like that it has the word override in it, and it's related to overrides in both the C# sense and the method impl sense, apparently. So, yeah, I would vote for preserve base overrides, and then I'm willing to accept Steve's suggestion that I'll never understand it, and we should move on.
I think I'm close to understanding what it does. Even if that's not true, that makes me happy enough.
All right, any objections to preserve base overrides attribute? Sold.
Was that a gavel I just heard in the background?
I hope so.
I mean, no, but you should have heard one in your head, so
Okay,
that means
great.
my power of suggestion worked.
I must be delirious then from lack of sleep.
Well, you're sitting outside. It's possible that one of your
heard the Law and
neighbors,
Order.
that your neighbors used one of them.
Yes.
All right, so then next one. So I don't know who marked this blocking. Was that me? Because I don't remember that.
No, it was me. Claire had emailed me about it. So I marked it block.
So what did Claire want us to do with that then?
Remove the obsolete attributes.
Well, presumably remove the EB never.
Or yeah, whatever it was. Yeah.
Isn't this a Roslyn bug?
Yeah, I'd say this is a VS or Roslyn or somebody bug, not a we don't want people to see this when writing new code.
So so I had this discussion. I filed a Roslyn bug item. I think they resolved it as won't fix. So they claim it's not a bug. The behavior works as designed. So the idea is that what you see in IntelliSense is a reflection of should you use this thing, and if any of the platforms marks this thing as EditorBrowsableNever, then the language service says, well, then you shouldn't use it. So we put a warning icon. We basically treat it as it doesn't exist. And I basically at some point gave up and said, fine, if that's the behavior that you want, then that's the behavior you want. I think we can independently decide that we make these things not EditorBrowsableNever, which I have said multiple times before that I'm generally not a fan of obsoleting. When we obsolete things, always apply EditorBrowsableNever, because it's nuanced, right? I'm personally okay with saying like we just remove EditorBrowsableNever and call it a day.
So this is the problem only exists if you have both the editor browsable and obsolete attribute, correct? That's not the behavior that you get if you just apply the editor browsable attribute.
Yeah, so to be clear, like what this IntelliSense feature does is, what you see is IntelliSense in a multi-targeted project. And normally what ends up happening is if the way the language service works, it runs IntelliSense in all projects and then aggregates the result. And if a particular member in IntelliSense is only present in one of those, then it shows the warning triangle. And so what they basically do is they say, well, we treat editor browsable as it's not in IntelliSense, and so they aggregate effectively the outcome of that. So in that sense, it's indistinguishable whether a platform doesn't have it or whether a platform has it but marked it editor browsable never. But yes, it has nothing to do with obsolete.
Seems weird that they're merging it based on IntelliSense because like this will compile. I mean, it'll compile with a warning because it's obsolete, but
I agree with that,
So-
but the argument was you shouldn't use it. So that's why we show you a warning triangle.
fair enough.
Well, you shouldn't use it because of the obsolete attribute, not because of the editor browsable.
No, because of editor browsable. That's their state. Like if you want
I mean,
something to
that-
be used, why would you mark editor browsable never?
That's not the behavior that or the meaning of the attribute that existed for 20, maybe not 20, 15 years. Like we cannot now change what a value of an attribute means.
So I don't disagree with you on that one, but I think to me that's an independent decision, right? So the question is first, should this be editor browsable never? And then regardless of that, should the IDE show a warning triangle in case of editor browsable never? Right? They're like, and we control one of them, not the other. And so like if you want to go like in the middle, there's this reference which is now closed, where I had this argument with the language team and I lost that argument.
Is there a sufficient number of APIs that are marked as both obsolete and editor browsable never where we actually care about this?
You mean did we care about the fact that the warning triangle doesn't show up?
No, I mean like so here's an example of an API that is marked as editor browsable never and obsolete, and people are trying to use it in a multi-target project. If not all three of those things are true at the same time, then this is a non-issue. So my question is, in what scenarios are all three of these things true at the same time? And are those scenarios numerous enough for us to care about this issue at all?
I don't think the obsolete's relevant. This is just EB
Okay.
never plus
Okay.
multi-target.
Sure, EB
think-
never and multi-target. Like, is there sufficient code base where people are calling APIs that are marked as editor browsable never within a multi-targeted project?
The thing that I worry about is now everybody who designs an API and wants to apply this attribute needs to think whether that's gonna be a problem or not.
Right, because our discussion on how to do, or our solution for how to do evolving default parameters is you take the one that used to have all the defaults, remove all the defaults, mark the method editor browsable never so it doesn't spoil IntelliSense, and then add a new one with more defaults.
Yeah.
Depending on the way that lines things up, it's going to give this warning. But like we don't want to leave them all visible because it's a mess. But if they're merging it just based on member name instead of member signature, then that would be fine. And then the only problem would be things here like enums, where we can decide we'll leave it obsolete visible instead of obsolete hidden.
But would you actually use such an API in a multi-targeted project?
You're calling the thing that took, or like you're calling a thing you've specified 3 parameters. The fact that the core compile binds to one that took 7 and the net standard 2 compile took one that had 6, you don't care. You wrote the same C# and it bound both ways.
But Levi, you're asking a question that's what I was trying to say. Maybe I didn't explain it super well. If we accept this, it means that from now on, every time somebody wants to apply this attribute, they need to, in their head, run through all the cases. Is it gonna ever be used in multi-targeting scenarios? Do we care? Like I really think that it will lead to, Jared calls it like spooky action at the distance.
Yeah,
and it's
yeah.
the same
No,
thing. Suddenly you need to consider so many moving parts before you can know what the behavior will be and whether you should be applying this attribute or not. And
I get that concern, but I thought that we were telling everyone like use net standard going forward, or just target net core 5 specifically. Like there's no need to multi-target anymore.
Well, if we remove the multi-targeting feature, then sure. Maybe then it's fine. But
You don't remove the multi-targeting feature. You just, if you have fewer and fewer cases where people are actually doing it, then this just kind of becomes a non-issue, just by virtue of the fact that people aren't writing code that runs into it, right?
So let me just split this thing. So regardless of how the feature works, it seems like we shouldn't mark these APIs editor browsable never and obsolete because the support is in core CLR now. So I think like this particular issue we can probably resolve if let's remove both of these attributes because they don't make sense for this particular feature. Independent of that, I'm totally fine with reopening this issue that I fought against the Roslyn guys and say, let's have a conversation again on this behavior, because I agree with Jeremy. I'm not entirely sure how this feature now plays with overload groups. Because it seems like when you look at the screenshot, there's a squiggly in the IDE for those cases. And the example Jeremy cited is perfectly fine, right? The only reason we apply editor browsable is to just remove visual clutter. And if that results in,
different visual clutter.
Yeah, well, basically false warnings, then it defeats the point, right? Now we basically just, as you said, we change one clutter against another clutter, which gives the user the wrong impression. So
yeah, the squiggly absolutely should not be there.
And that's, I think, a problem. So I don't know whether the squiggly is there because Andrew is having some other, analyzer that runs that does the same kind of thing, or whether that's actually done by the IDE already. Because I think the warning triangle only appears in IntelliSense. It's still bad, but that's nowhere near as bad as the squiggly would be. Yeah. So like, okay, let me do this. Let me just go into this issue again, and let's open this again, and let's just say, okay, we would like to have a conversation on this with a larger group of people, maybe, instead of just me and Cyrus, and then doopsie.
Sure. So it sounds like you were saying the warning triangle is okay, but the squiggly is unacceptable because the thing will compile just fine.
That's my feeling.
Maybe there's a more different color squiggly because it is obsolete and you still need to suppress that.
Yeah, so the suggested edit that you have on the attributes emo is to remove the obsolete, but presumably the runtime team is the one who put the obsolete there, and they did it with intent. I don't know that we would remove the obsolete that was an intentional obsolete just to make an experience better if it was intentful.
So I agree with that, but like I had this conversation with the runtime team, right? So if you scroll up here, there's I basically said, actually scroll down apparently. So I said, are we okay with these changes then? Because he said, like, originally they were marked this way because we didn't have the support. But since 3.0 we have that support, so that they are no longer valid. So we should just literally remove them and make them full-blown APIs.
So this isn't functionality we plan on taking away. This is functionality we lacked and have since added?
Correct. That's my understanding based on what they said. That's why I said I think for this issue we should just remove these attributes, and I think that's the correct call for this feature. But I'm still concerned about the behavior. We'd like to have a conversation about this behavior because EditorBrowsableNever API isn't meant to indicate won't work. All right.
Yeah, because we can fix the issue for .NET 5, but we can't fix it for other targets where it's already been obsolete.
Right.
Okay.
All right, so then let's just say that is the change you would like to make. So bum. I guess that's good enough. All right, so now we walk the tail. So I don't know who marked this. So I guess it's they already did, I think, one pass. How did we mark it at that point?
Needs work.
Apparently. But it almost sounds like that. Yeah, we marked it needs work. And then okay, so what has changed then? Delete async, get async, send async on a client. Let me
and something that looks a lot like the what do we call it? Options bag from the new SystemNet API.
So yeah, so last time they basically proposed a type derived from message handler, WebAssembly HTTP handler, then there's a new request cache, a new request credentials, and a new request mode enum. And now what they're proposing is very different from that. They're basically saying we have 3 new methods that take request options. And supposedly request options is new. So my immediate reaction is, why is there an interface? Why is there not a base type? And
Yep.
other than that, I think I can live with that.
It's not only why it's an interface and a base type. Why do we need an abstraction for this? Is there more implementations than just HTTP request options of this abstraction?
This looks like it's following the typical ASP.NET like HTTP feature pattern, which we tend not to use in the BCL.
Right.
Yeah. So what does this extension method do? Get from JSON async is basically just, I guess we already have that, right?
Yeah,
that's
I assume they're just adding the options as a thing to pass in.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And then on the request message, we just add the request options, and that's where the interface comes in. But yeah, I agree with Christoph. That seems we might as well expose HTTP request options there.
Right. Well, because essentially it looks like by exposing it as the interface, I think they're assuming no one will ever cast it, and therefore that now they've exposed a read-only model instead of a read-write model.
So can I interrupt the discussion for a second? Has anyone from Carol's team looked at this? This is affecting like key design points.
Well, David Schulman commented on it. Corey clearly looked at it based on the comments. I don't think anybody has looked at it since they updated their proposal.
Yeah, I don't think. I think we should get buy-off from David and Corey before we go ahead with this.
Yeah, because one of my biggest pieces of feedback is that it looks like a feature that is very similar to a feature they're trying to do for connections, and that we should only figure out what we want that to look like once.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's adding a property bag and whatever else. So
Property bag, that's what we called it. Yes. Thank you, Steve.
you're welcome.
So let me do this then. Let me remove this from ready to review to API suggestion. And then say please mark it API ready for review.
Another thing that I think would be good to add is we need somebody from the team who adds this, added the proposal in the next review. I don't, like even if the networking team kind of looks at it and says reasonable, it would be good to have a person who understands why the design is done the way it's done.
I agree with that. Let me actually just grab the URL. All right, let's close this guy then.
Do we have anyone from the language team here?
No, I don't think so.
So basically, what they're proposing is an API to allow a method to be marked as a module initializer. If you're not familiar with that concept, a module initializer is code that runs before any other code in the DLL runs. So the idea is it runs before type initializers, static initializers, things like that. It's normally used, at least we've actually used it in the past within ASP.NET, to do things like capability checking and kilbit checking. I imagine it could also be useful for things like loading your own dependencies, but they've listed other things here. To be honest, I don't know why we need an API for it, since it is something that's entirely an implementation detail of the compiler itself, but sure.
Presumably, they need to know which method you wanted to have that role.
Yeah, basically,
Yeah, so
they don't want language syntax, right? They just want to say use the assemblies, the attribute syntax to express that.
Yeah, like I guess my question was I don't know why they can't just fabricate one on the fly if they see module initializer in brackets, but so be it.
Well, that's not usually how we do things.
The question. What do you mean modular initializer in brackets? Oh, you mean like a fake? They see something called module initializer that looks like an attribute. It doesn't actually require it to exist.
Yeah, and then they just say, oh, this is a module initializer, and emit the correct IL. Like, I don't know why they need an actual honest-to-God attribute for that, but whatever.
Because now you'd have to decide if somebody does have a thing called module initializer attribute, did it bind to both or the declared one? Does that change the semantic meaning? Like, that sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah. Also, IntelliSense doesn't work, right? And like, you get squigglers in the IDE. Like,
Sure,
I think,
fair.
Yeah, I think there's I think in general, I think it makes sense to say if there is no language syntax, they want a dedicated type so that everything just works. I think to me the question though is
that's what source generators are for.
Yeah, I think to me the question is if it is an attribute that people are expected to apply manually, I don't think we want this thing to be in system runtime compiler services because that's supposed to be the shit that nobody ever touches because only the compiler looks there. So if human beings are looking there, it probably should be in some other namespace.
So only very, 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 very few people, like vanishingly few people, are going to apply this attribute. Like more people are going to apply things like method impl, and that's already in compiler services.
But I mean, yeah. So if people are supposed to do it, like STA thread and thread static and other things that people use that are, I mean, STA thread nobody uses it; they just let the template generator put it there for them. But those are in system. If we think it's rare, then maybe interop services. It's kind of wrong, but
I mean, it is a compiler-specific feature. Why wouldn't it be in compiler services?
Because then now they're going to be pulling in the using for all of the attributes that we want them to never, ever, ever touch.
But I can literally count on both of my hands probably the total number of projects in the world which will use this attribute.
Oh, you're so totally wrong. Everyone's going to abuse the heck out of this.
No, like no one understands this feature. Like
I know, and that's why they're going to abuse
it. So let me come back to my earlier point where people already widely use things like method impl today, and that is in system runtime compiler services. So people who want to change those behaviors are already pulling in that namespace. I don't see this as causing harm in that regard.
So, I mean, that argument I buy. I think if the argument is very few people are using this, then putting it in the compiler service is probably acceptable. But we generally, I just agree with Jeremy. My concern is if many people are using the namespace, now you have this fairly convoluted namespace that is imported, right? Because the vast majority of stuff in there is not meant to be used by user code. Like the way to think about compiler services, it's not really about whether it's a compiler feature. It's more are calls to or usages of these APIs generated by the compiler or they're generated by a human.
So this attribute literally has no meaning to the runtime. Like the runtime will ignore the attribute if it sees it. The attribute is interpreted by the compiler to cause it to emit different IL when compiling this method.
Right. But I mean, in that sense, it's not different from, let's say, the nullable attributes that we have. and we put them in system diagnostics dot whatever it was.
It's also no different from method info options at that point.
Yeah, looking at the things that are in compiler services, we do have the unsafe class, which people use even, and method impl, and apparently conditional weak table also lives in compiler services. So
that was a mistake.
If this namespace is the namespace of I really know what I'm doing, then and we hope, because I hope no one uses this feature. I expect every tiny little project is going to start abusing it. Whereby abusing it, I mean using it and then not understanding the consequences. So maybe compiler services is fine.
I guess that argument I can get behind. Like if you say people are, generally speaking, like basically if the intent is, the namespace is for things that the compiler generates the uses for, or humans are generating them, but we generally don't want them to call these APIs, which is probably true for unsafe, and it's probably true for method impl as well. Then I think it's probably fair to say, yeah, this thing goes in there, and the 6 people in the world that we want them to use this thing, they can find it. All right, so let me just write this as a comment.
Are the attributes correct? Per the that's a fun sentence. It should be method sealed. Good times.
It says method and allow multiple false.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, because remember, the runtime itself is not interpreting this attribute, nor are tools like IL, spy. The only entity that ever looks at the attribute is the compiler.
Right. In that case, I think we're fine with that. So since I didn't hear anything else, I assume that's...
Seems legit.
It actually is a really useful feature for people who need it. So that's good.
You say that until you realize everybody's deadlocking because people take locks in this code.
Fortunately, it's called outside the loader lock.
It doesn't prevent people from having their own mutex, though.
That's true.
All right. Yeah, this one probably requires runtime presence as well. Is David Ryan's on the call? Probably not, right? No, he dropped off. All right, so then this one we need the runtime team, because I give it a quick read, but this is one of those features that is fairly involved, so needs runtime.
Or is he getting on the call?
Not that I can see.
No. That's too bad. Okay.
One thing I would say, kind of, maybe for the future, the name of this interface is so nice and appealing, and I don't know if we want to kind of burn it for, committer of the future.
Well, I mean, in .NET, almost or everything that's not a value type is a castable object. So, yeah, the name would definitely need some work.
By the way, this belongs in interop services, not compiler services. Like, definitely.
Yeah, like, let's just close this tab before we go too much in this direction. I think this is, this was one of the linker features that I think we reviewed already. No? Okay, it was a different one we reviewed. but that's the same thing. We probably need somebody from the linker team to actually comment on this.
I mean, I think this is, we already approved dynamically access members attribute. They just need us to add a new attribute target to it.
Because I mean, I can't find any history on this one here.
Right. Well, it says like the title is allow it on methods, and then there's a comment right in the 2/3 down on your screen now. Stop. That says that all they want to do is add attribute target member or method or.
We want to allow this attribute on methods, specifically methods on the type class.
Yeah, so the proposed API box, it looks like we have it for field return, generic parameter, parameter, and property, and they want to also
I get it now.
allow it to be applied to method.
We already approved the attribute, and it's not listed here because it's a different issue, and they only want to have this one thing.
Yeah.
Well, that seems totally fine to me.
Yeah, if it's the thing that the feature needs, then
yeah,
sure.
I agree then. Okay, let's make this human readable.
Why would we do that?
Some definition of human and readable, I suppose.
Well, machines.
Yeah, this one definitely does not need more discussion.
Oh man. So this is wherein I want to introduce an intentional breaking change to the runtime. So there are a bunch of CAS attributes which are holdovers from the early days of full framework. They control things like I'm allowed to access a network, I'm allowed to access a file system, so on. One of those attributes is called PrincipalPermissionAttribute, which says check the current thread principal, and if it is this user or member of the security group, either allow permission to access this method or deny permission to access this method. Now, these attributes are declarative. You put them on methods, and the runtime enforces them at all method entry points in full framework. In .NET Core, these attributes have no implementation whatsoever, and the runtime does not honor them. The runtime ignores them. Now, this is a problem because when you're porting your code from full framework to .NET Core, if you have these attributes on your methods, you're not going to receive any type of compiler warning or error, and they no-op at runtime, meaning they fail open.
Right.
We already have at least one bug report of somebody who was surprised that their code was executing when they believed it should not have executed. My recommendation here is we kill the ability to specify principal permission attribute on methods in .NET 5.
So
yeah.
So I mean, basically, so I think the difference for people on the call, because I've used this as well in the past, this is different from normal CAS in the sense that normal CAS is really about sandboxing the process itself, versus this one is really used for people as a convenient way to enforce application level security that they have. Like they have admins and non-admins, or they have, call center people, non-call center people, and they want to basically protect their code, and they just rely on the infrastructure to do it for them, right? And it's a kind of like
this is actually popular. This is popular to put on methods inside of web services, especially web services that impersonate their callers, because you can put this attribute on an MVC controller, for instance, and it will control all calls into that controller in full framework.
Concern I have is, shouldn't we go through obsolete as warning and then maybe next release obsolete as error. This seems to be, because I understand there are some users who may be, shooting themselves in the foot with this, but there may be others who ported the code and they kind of don't care, and suddenly we would break them. So
the problem with that is it's literally the equivalent of saying in your code, I want to do a check to make sure that this user is some account before executing the method, and us ignoring that statement in the code.
I understand that. Yeah, I understand that, but because some of this code was written explicitly. Somebody said they want that. Some of it can be kind of accidental leftover, and nobody cares anymore.
Right.
And suddenly we just it becomes an error. That seems like something that we've never done before.
I think so. Let's just have two independent discussions on this, because I think I would agree with Levi. The problem today is you have zero indication that your code. I mean, because if you test security, then usually what you do is you test that stuff works, right? And then you may also test that stuff doesn't work, but that's usually harder. So people will run their apps in production, they work fine, except that not everybody can access everything, which is probably not what they wanted. And I think that I would agree with Levi, that's a problem we should fix. And to me, honestly, putting obsolete on it seems like a reasonable thing to do. And honestly, even putting it as error true is also fine in my opinion, because it's a compile time error, right? You're not actually breaking anybody with roll forward. So if people recompile, if people port their code from .NET Framework to .NET Core, for example, they immediately get an error message that tells them like, yeah, this stuff doesn't work. Now, maybe error is too harsh because you literally break forward progress that people can make. But I'd say at the minimum, making it obsolete makes sense to me.
Yeah, definitely.
So I wanted to distinguish just regular obsolation of all of the cast attributes, which I think we should do anyway, as warning, versus this particular issue, which is that this one very particular member, the constructor, should be obsolete as error. And again, the reason for that is you as a developer went out of your way to specify this, and you should receive a compile time error saying, hey, like, this does not do what you think it does, and in fact, it's probably going to lead to a security hole in your application. Right. This requires you to address it before you can compile successfully.
Because, you mentioned that being error blocks forward progress, but it doesn't, because in this case, we're saying commenting out this line of code has the same effect as if we didn't mark it as obsolete. So the forward progress is you just comment out all the errors, which is generally how I get through errors.
I guess that's fair, because it's an attribute. It also is fairly easy to comment out, probably. I buy that.
Does no warn apply to obsolete marked as error true?
No, unfortunately not.
No. You have to address it.
Is that true even if you give it a diagnostic ID?
That's my testing showed that was the case. Like my testing showed that if obsolete as error is true, you can't call the API under any circumstance.
Except reflection.
Yeah.
Except reflection, but you can't apply an attribute using reflection, which is all this is intended to do. Yeah. So one of the other proposals I had here, by the way, was if we don't want to obsolete this constructor as error, one of the other things we could do is remove all of the attribute targets from this attribute.
Which is the same compile error.
Well, it means that you could use the attribute programmatically if you wanted to, but you just can't apply to anything.
Yeah, I don't like that, because I think the benefit of obsoleting the constructor is you know what people are doing, and you basically tell them this won't work, versus if you remove the attribute targets, the compiler gives you a very generic error message like this attribute can't be applied or something, right? Versus this one will tell you, I know what you're trying to do, this ain't work, and here's a link where you can read more. Or it doesn't do what you think it does, basically.
One of the other things I said in this proposal is I'm intentionally not obsoleting the other members, because maybe you still want to be able to call get custom attributes and inspect this thing. Like whatever, that scenario is not dangerous. It's useless, but it's not dangerous.
Yeah, except in that case, it's kind of weird if you literally make the constructor an error, because that means people couldn't have applied it, right? I mean, you could only get it from
previous TFMs.
In previous TFMs, yes.
Right.
I assume there's a 2 or 3 line programmatic snippet that could be put at the beginning of the method to fully replace what this does, or what it's meant to do.
Yes.
And we would include whatever that is in the message, or the thing that the message links to, right?
Yeah. Basically, it's kind of like an argument null check at the beginning of your method. You basically say if thread.currentPrincipal.identity equals something or not equal something, throw.
Or has role or isn't role or something, yeah.
Yeah, is in role
Yeah.
or.
Yeah.
I mean, that's also something where potentially I could imagine us doing a code fixer for. It just spits out the one line of code. I mean, that would not be entirely horrible.
Is that a better route, an on by default analyzer plus fixer?
I mean, the thing is, I think to me, an analyzer versus hopping obsolete is almost indistinguishable because they would do the same thing. So it would be, let's say, obsolete plus fixer.
Well,
But
to have the fixer, you need the analyzer. And so if we're going to write the analyzer anyway, I'm wondering if...
Yeah, I mean, like that's. I'm just saying, from a resulting user experience, there really isn't any difference. The only difference would be if we don't have a code fixer now and we do the code fixer later, then marking it error now has the downside people will comment it out, so they will no longer have a target to invoke the code fixer on, right? So the value of the fixer will go down if we mark it error now. If that makes sense.
So the code fixer is not as straightforward as one would think. The reason for that is if you want something that is runtime compatible with what this would have done, you have to go through principal permission as a type, which I want to obsolete, not as part of this proposal, but eventually. And I don't think we want a fixer that puts APIs that will be obsolete in the near future in your code.
I would agree with that.
I guess that leads to that feeds into my concern, which is if we can't succinctly say what someone should replace this with, we're going to be causing people a whole lot of grief.
Yeah, well, I think part of the problem is this only made sense on Windows.
We can say, yeah, we can say what it can be replaced with, but what it can be replaced with is really dependent on your scenario. So, for example, if you're inside of an ASP.NET application, like you should use the ASP.NET attributes rather than programmatic checks. If you're inside of a WinForms or WPF application, then you should use programmatic checks instead of an attribute, and so on.
Yeah,
I mean, the fixer can suggest multiple fixes.
Yeah, and if you're inside of a library, like God help you.
Right.
But that gets to the point, right? I think we should. I personally believe like having a fixer that is 80% correct is still more valuable than having no fixer. Like in the end of the day, like you have to. One of the fixers can do is like emit a comment and says like, this might not work in all cases, so make sure to read this document over here. But the problem is that people generally don't read guidance, and so if you just make their code slightly better, then you're still making most code better, because otherwise people would just do a random choice or not do anything, just comment out the attribute, which is probably not right in most of the cases, right? So
I mean, if you comment out the attribute, at least you're taking the explicit step to remove something that you believe to be a security check. Like once you start commenting out code, like that's on you to understand the consequence of what that commenting out did.
Sure. Like I'm just trying to be pragmatic about like if our goal is to get more people to write correct code, then if you have an existing app that requires that behavior, just commenting the line is probably not resulting in more correct behavior, right? You can say, yeah, the onus is on the developer now because there's no longer a promise that we have to fulfill, but the net effect is still the same, right?
Yeah, so what happens if... Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Since we have experience writing analyzers and fixers now, hooray. What about a path where we say, right now we'll let it go error is warning, or sorry, not error is warning, obsolete is warning. And if the fixer gets written to replace it with thread.currentPrincipal.isInRole thing, because even if it's checking for an exact username, the username is in that role, at least on Windows. Like we now have a fixer. We could also add a second fixer to the same problem that uses the ASP.NET attribute if we wanted. And then once we have a thing that somebody can do apply this fixer for, then we can flip it to error true of no, there's no going back now.
So
which it may all be the same release. It's just making sure that we hedge our things that are in disparate repositories.
One of the things that was mentioned earlier is it's okay if the fixer is 80% correct. What happens if I'm in the 20% case where the fixer sees this attribute, I right-click, say fix, it injects the wrong code into my method, and then I deploy into production?
You changed your code, it's on you?
No, I did what Microsoft told me to do. Microsoft changed my code. I did not.
Yeah, I mean, like, so part of the question, like, I don't know what the, because if principal permission is sealed and it's creating a permission, then presumably, or principal permission attribute is creating a permission, presumably it's creating the principal permission, and that is doing the same thing. The only contextual difference, I can speak, would be if, or whether or not thread.currentPrincipal is there, but that would have, CAS would have had the same problem of if you're in a mode where the current principal doesn't get set, it'll behave differently. So I'm not quite understanding the scenario where the code we would generate would be wrong. It could be less good than other code, but I don't see where it would be wrong. If there's a bunch of nuance to the principal permission, then sure. But
so I encourage you to take a look at the implementation of principal permission and imagine what it would be to inject that implementation into the top of every method that has principal permission attribute on it.
But isn't that what someone wanted when they applied the attribute?
Yes, that file is 300 lines of code.
Okay, but they're not. That file is handling all possible cases. The code that's injected handles one specific case.
No, the code, that 300 line of code, handles you're right, it handles the various different security actions, names, roles that might exist, but we would have to do the same thing, would we not?
The fixer would have to do the same thing. The code it would generate would handle whatever the specific things that were mentioned in the attribute.
So we're talking maybe 20 or 30 lines of code then.
Well, right. 2/3 of the code in this in principalPermission.cs is CAS, union, and intersect stuff.
Yeah.
So if you throw that out, it's just the demand method, which is 50 lines of code and doesn't look like it's very clean code. So yes, it's maybe 20 lines of code, but probably a lot less because a lot of it's about the state that it managed from its constructor. So, I mean, 20 lines of code is still high, but I think that we can probably get there, and or to throw in the comment that says, like, you know, make sure or verify this before deploying, and if somebody checks in code that says verify before deploying, well, we did warn them with the fixer. I mean, it's not great, but if someone literally does a bulk fix blind commit, then like there's nothing we could have done to help them anyway.
So we want the fixer then to accompany this.
I think it has goodness, and while I can appreciate that there's some nuance, trading off my security hat and my user experience hat, I think it's better to have it than not.
Okay.
Somebody
So
applauding, or is that noise unrelated?
Unrelated.
Okay.
It's the gavel of applause.
It's my hand was bored, so it started drumming on my leg.
I see.
It needs to be typing.
So is there pushback against obsoleting as error and having a fixer in the same release, assuming we can do them both?
I think in the same release is fine. Like that's what I said. Like to me, the only concern is if you split them apart, then making it an error will make the fixer, I guess, less useful. But if we do it in the same release, it's fine.
Where would such a fixer live?
It would go in with the other fixers in the Roslyn analyzers repo.
Okay.
And it would ship with the .NET 5 SDK, right? And we would, similar to what Steven said, right? If we do obsolete, then it's obviously always on. If it's the custom analyzer, then we would turn it always on, and then the fixer would also always be on.
The fixer would be always available.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the fixer is effectively like if you have code, right? It will suggest it.
Right.
So, Levi, one question. How many customers do you know that like ran into this issue? Like, is it a very big problem, or you heard from one customer that they were surprised?
So there are two customers that I've heard of that encountered problems when they were migrating their stuff onto .NET Core. I know that using this attribute is very, very common in ASP.NET applications, especially people who have customized SharePoint components. If you are migrating those applications onto ASP.NET Core, you're probably going to run into problems. One thing that I think will bite people is that this attribute might be in their libraries that they're using. And when they're migrating those libraries to run on .NET Core, even though those libraries are consumed by ASP.NET applications, that they're going to encounter the incorrect behavior at that point.
But this won't help that.
I mean, if you recompile, it'll help. Or if you attempt to open the project at all in Visual Studio, it'll help, as long as you target the correct version of .NET Core.
If you mean libraries they wrote themselves that they're migrating, sure, but
they wrote themselves.
In dependency libraries, which means that it's only when the dependency actually updates.
No, in any such library, generally you would write yourself and share between your client and your server code, but the library is part of that cohesive application set. Like, dependencies generally don't include this attribute. It doesn't make sense.
Just as one point of reference, and I realize it's not a complete picture, APIs of .NET shows this principal permission attribute being used by 0.2%.
Yeah, I was just looking at that too, but to Levi's point, we don't really have. Yeah, we don't really have coverage for websites, right? Because API port telemetry is mostly desktop apps.
I understand. That's what I was saying. It's an incomplete picture, but
yeah,
it is the data point.
Yeah, no, and it's a good data point too. Like, it's generally you would really only see this when you're porting your app itself. Libraries, I'm pretty confident we're not going to break libraries here.
But when people run API port over applications too, no?
Yeah, but the problem is that if you have an existing web forms app, like the API port works over binaries, right? It doesn't, and usually you don't have binaries for websites in many cases. So that's why I think the vast majority of API port data is effectively desktop apps, console apps, and libraries. So it has a very heavy bias towards that. So yeah, I would agree with Levi. Like, I mean, to me, based on anecdotal evidence, I think this thing at some point used to be fairly popular. People used the shit out of this because it was convenient to do role-based security in your web apps. It's kind of weird to do it on the client. I've seen it too, but as the data suggests, it's not very popular on client.
You see it sometimes in Windows services, but not that commonly.
Yeah, I guess. I think most of the time, like the fact that it's not used by libraries also gives me hope, because to your earlier point, right, in libraries, God help you, but we don't have a replacement for it. But it will also be very weird to ship a library that has dedicated users and roles, so it seems fine. I mean, one other option we have is we can do the more, crawl, walk, run thing. We can just say, well, how about we just don't make it an error, we just make it a warning and don't ship the fixer, and then see how many people actually complain. Because that gives people. Well, because then you can say, like, we can dilute the fixer later. But we told people that this stuff will not work.
I mean, as soon as we mark it as warning, this one probably requires a dedicated page, if not so probably a dedicated diagnostic ID, and then the page is going to say, if you had code like this, then write code like this, and now it's copy paste instead of a fixer. So there's not, the difference is we made someone do more work. So if we're trying to measure how much screaming people do, then sure.
Well, I think also a guide would avoid the problem that somebody just right-clicks and says, fix it for me, and then it does something wrong, if there's a risk of it. If it's a guide, like how-to guide, I think the how-to guide can say, if this is your case, this is what you do. If this is your case, you do something slightly different. And by the way, there are some other unusual cases you on your own.
Okay.
Whereas fixer cannot do that.
I mean, I would just agree with Jeremy though. Like, to me, so when we say there could be a page, we will definitely. I think in practice we will not spend a lot of time writing that page, right? If you're not willing to write the analyzer, we're also not very willing to write that page, in my opinion. And if you're very willing to write the page, then we're probably also very willing to write the analyzer, right? So that's why I said that to me the compromise would be we just put a string there. We may even give it the diagnostic ID for good measure, but because that's very cheap for us to do. And then if enough people complain, we may add the page, and then if enough people complain, we do the rest as well, right?
I mean, we should add the page anyway, honestly. Like, we need to document this thing.
Yeah. If we feel that strongly, then let's just do the analyzer then as well.
But analyzer, the issue is not just this is not just work, it's reliability. Analyzer needs to be 100% reliable, and page doesn't have to be.
Why would it have to be 100% reliable?
The page?
We don't want to write the wrong thing into your code.
Yeah.
No, but like,
the
how is it
page
different from 99% of code fixes that the IDE already gives you today? None of them are 100%. They are all like, I give you some code to start with, but you may have to tweak it, right? I mean, if you implement
This one potentially exposes you to a security hole.
Yeah, like if I'm returning the wrong exception message, I don't really care. If I'm allowing a non-admin to access my admin portal, I care.
Yes.
Sure, like so I guess the line you would have to draw in the sand is that you're not more permissive, right? But if you call the wrong API and you say like if not is in roll throw, then the problem that you probably have is that the thing will throw more often than it probably should have. But you probably don't have this problem that it will throw less often, right? And so that seems to be like a reasonable starting point as well.
Do we have precedent for a fixer saying, I don't really know what you're doing, you have to go read this page instead?
Well, as Jeremy said, you just offer multiple fixers.
Sorry, say that again?
It just doesn't offer the fixer. If it doesn't know what to do, there is none offered.
Then you just go to the diagnostic for the analyzer.
Well, or you just have like
maybe,
option A, option B, option C, so you show fixer A, B, and C, and let the user pick which one to invoke, right? Like if there are multiple options, that's the solved problem.
Yeah, but if we write the analyzer to handle only cases that we're pretty confident that we can get correct, then my concern level goes down quite a bit.
Right, which you can do, right? You could just say, look at the attribute and say, oh, they used this one, so this is the line of code we probably should emit.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the analyzer is easy. You used principal permission attribute.
Yeah.
The fixer is.
Oh, what?
One fixer option is inject thread.currentPrincipal is enroll. Another fixer would be to replace the one attribute with the ASP.NET attribute, and etc. And
yeah,
multiple fixers for the same problem is something that the system already handles. And somebody would have the option of picking, go apply use the ASP.NET attribute to every violation of this in this, whatever scopes they go up to. But
document project solution.
Yeah.
And so project probably is
makes sense.
Easy to decide on.
Okay, yeah, I feel a lot better about that then, as long as we would be able to target the fixer to things that we're confident that we can generate the correct code for.
Yeah. Or
yeah, and then for everything else, like read the docs.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which we'll have to, once we have the analyzer, we have to have the documentation for the analyzer, and then we could use the same diagnostic ID for both. Maybe weird to have both the straight compile for obsolete and the analyzer to produce the same ID, but it should be fine? Yeah. Question mark. Maybe maybe the fix can even trigger off of the compile error, but I think it needs the rest of the diagnostic state.
Are there any other attributes you would apply this to? Because I think the value will go up if you apply multiple attributes. Multiple obsolete attributes on different types, because then you can tie them all together.
This is the only one that's causing active harm to the ecosystem. All of the other CAS attributes are no ops, so I don't really care.
In that case, I don't care. Then let's just go with the normal built-in diagnostic.
The big sweeping statement that we made with CAS is like that we made deny fail because we weren't going to make it work. So all the CAS permissions throw on deny.
Yeah.
But
well, not the attributes, only the permissions. The attributes can never throw because there's no code running.
Right.
So, okay, we could roll into, as part of this, security action.deny should be obsolete as error as well.
I mean, it seems fine. It's throw everywhere in core, but this one is because it's implicitly a deny is the problem. And so this one, I don't know that there are any other, because I intentionally don't know anything about CAS. So I don't know if there are others that are in the same bucket of this looks like it's testing for a thing that would always be there because we've said that everything's always there. But this is external to the runtime, so we couldn't actually prove it was there. I hope it's the only one, but if there is anything else, then we should get it in the same release.
It's the only one I'm aware of, but that's a good point, though. There are The other things that would go along the lines of what you just said is if, as you said, whenever you have a programmatic permission and then you call deny, like you said, we throw at that point, but we don't throw in the attributes themselves because, again, no code's running. What we could do as part of this is we could have an analyzer that says, hey, you have a CAS attribute here that also has security action.deny passed into it. That attribute is not going to be honored by the core runtime. You must fix this in your code. And there's no fixer there because there's literally no way to do what you were trying to accomplish. The fixer literally is remove the attribute.
Yeah, adding an analyzer that says that produces a diagnostic if you use any code access security attribute that uses security action deny seems legit because it won't work.
Yeah.
Or whatever the right words are for that.
I think that would also address
it
most of the security problems, right? Or security concerns, because you tell people that it won't work. And that I think is
and there's no fixer at that point.
No, the fixer is just re-architect your shit. I mean, don't rely on CAS.
Yeah. So how about this then? Let me open up a separate issue to track creating an analyzer for that, potentially with an obsolete of security action .deny, and maybe whatever else needs to be in there.
Okay.
I mean, honestly, we should obsolete as warning quite literally every single type in the security permissions namespace. Like, we should do that. We should obsolete as error this thing that we were considering as part of this issue, plus a few other things.
Yeah, the thing with error is we just have to keep in mind we can't suppress it, right? Everything else we can be very liberal, but the error ones we have to be very deliberate which ones we tackle.
Right.
And then
cross-targeting can quote suppress it by making it a conditional compile, but
yeah. And at some point we definitely should obsolete them as errors. Just to make my position clear, I just would do it in stages. Like first as warning, let people like give them one release, maybe even one dot release to prepare, and then say it's gone. You didn't read the warnings, too bad. Immediately obsoleting as error seems like, geez, such a strong hammer.
Yeah, but I mean, if we did it for assuming our current plan still holds, and 5 is not LTS but 6 is LTS, making it warning and 5 an error and 6 to some probably bigger than 50% of our user base, that's the same as we made it error in the first release.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
one. I do understand the concern there. Like, it's the reason I wanted to special cases though is because like this is so egregiously bad. If it's seen in your code, you must take immediate action to address it.
Yeah.
So then, to summarize, so for this issue, so basically we are happy with the obsolete strategy. We are also happy with making it an error. We should also provide a fixer with the potential suggestions. Either apply SPNet core attributes using the threads principle, whatever. And we should also consider generic analyzer that wants on security action deny usage across all attributes. Are there anything else?
Obsolete as warning everything in security permissions. But maybe that's a separate thing.
Yeah, that I would check out separately. I mean, I would definitely agree with that statement though. All right, then let me just approve this here as it is. So we haven't talked about it must blocking somewhere. We haven't really talked about what the message will be, but I guess that's not something we need to review here because that's just wordsmithing.
Yeah, yeah. It would just say like, hey, this doesn't actually deny in .NET Core. See this URL for more information.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, let me just add at least this one because I'm pretty sure we want to have an attribute there, right?
Yeah. Did I properly mark this as a break and change?
You did.
Okay, good.
Yeah. And then, yeah, my quick gut check says that if everything just works, if we use the same diagnostic ID in the obsolete error here and the the analyzer that has to exist in order to trigger the fixer, then we should do that.
So are we using the better obsolation mechanism here to give it a different diagnostic ID?
Honestly, like if the only attribute you use it is 1, I'm fine with only giving it a URL. And URL is already part of the new thing, right? You couldn't give a URL before. You would have to
But
put
if we're
the URL.
if we're making a fixer, that means we have an analyzer, and that means we have a diagnostic ID for the analyzer, which means why would one of them get the generic obsolete and the other one gets the specific obsolete?
Sorry, I'm confused by that. Like if you have an analyzer, if you have a fixer, doesn't mean you have an analyzer. They are all orthogonal things, right?
I think I feel like the fixer triggers off the diagnostic ID.
Yeah, what would you trigger off some other diagnostic?
It doesn't reanalyze the code. It usually ends up having to do something
I guess,
complicated,
if you,
similar to reanalyzing the code to know how to fix it. But
I guess that's fair.
It's activated by the diagnostic ID.
Yeah,
The diagnostic ID of the obsolete attribute or the diagnostic ID of the analyzer, or are they just kind of the same?
So in principle, you could.
What diagnostic ID wakes it up?
Yeah, in principle, you could say your fixer fixes the obsolete, the generic obsolete diagnostic, but that now means your fixer will get invoked for everything that's obsolete, and you have to always say, no, I'm not handling this. No, I'm not handling this. In which case, you're better off just saying this guy gets a diagnostic ID, and then you only trigger on that one.
Got it.
Yeah, and if the compiler producing a diagnostic from this is enough to wake up a fixer, then we don't need the separate analyzer class. I don't know that we've ever thought of that, so I don't know if it will work.
Okay.
Like it could just be 2 different pipelines in the compiler.
Sorry, what was the question?
Whether the obsolete attribute producing a diagnostic will cause a fixer to run, or if we need to redundantly write the analyzer for it.
No, it will work. That was one of the things we discussed with the team.
Oh,
because
cool.
It's the same. It is the same pipeline. Like, and by extension, it also means we should be able to remove an obsolete or make it an analyzer, right? I mean, technically that's not entirely true because it would only work for C# MVB, but the idea was, well, if our rules get more complicated, and then we might do that, right? Remove the obsolete and make an analyzer, and that should have no observable side effects. Unless
because you can preserve the diagnostic ID at that point.
You can clear the analyzer pipeline. You can't
Sure.
clear the obsolete analysis, but
yes,
that's a very, very, very small difference.
All right, so then
this makes sense then. So, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so then the only thing we should agree on is the diagnostic ID, which we haven't really done yet. So we should just come up with something.
OBS 1000, OBS 1000.
Whatever.
And then the next one's 1001, then 1002.
Yeah, so my care level is relatively low from aesthetic standpoints. The problem is that we need to be careful that we pick a prefix that only we control, right? Mm-hmm. And that was the discussion we had with the language team was, well, some people said, oh, let's just use the FXCOP model, which is, fully qualified names effectively, but that unfortunately doesn't really work on the user experience because they render the string in plenty places where if it starts with Microsoft, then the only thing you ever see is Mike, and then that's the end of it, right? So I don't know, like, let's have a separate meeting on this because we also have this generic, let's obsolete some stuff thing that I still have to do, and I would just, once we have 10 or 15 items, I think it's easy for us to just come up with some, prefix and numbering scheme for that.
Sure.
I proposed BCL and then running number. Not great, but probably doable.
Yeah.
All right,
That's
so
fine.
then, you have it here, breaking change, and then I'm not sure whether we track
Sounds
source
good, and
breaking and other breaking differently, but that seems fine.
I don't think we do.
Yeah, I think breaking change just means we need we need to write the doc about it in the breaking changes in this release document.
Yeah. We need to get resources to write the fixer then, because I guess we just signed ourselves up for work.
That is correct.
The API is approved. Both aspects are required to go in the same release.
Yeah. I mean, I can do the obsolation in relatively short order and get it in, but I don't have either the expertise or the bandwidth to write a fixer. So it might come in a future preview, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, previews I don't care.
As long
like,
as we're not sticklers. Yeah, if we're not sticklers that they have to come in the same preview, then that makes life easier.
Yeah, I don't think we care about that. But I don't think any of our analyzers have moved into the pipeline for previews yet. So
Perfect.
yeah. All right, so then
I might get some bandwidth to write the fixer come like December.
that'd be post-release, so that's,
Yeah,
that's a little, yeah, we'll work something out.
I'm not an expert in releases, but if you do your work after the release is done, I'm pretty sure it's not making that release. All right, so then let's get the next one then. Does anybody have context on this one?
So I prepared this, but I don't think, because I updated the labels and everything late last night, I don't think there was time to include David and Saurabh to the reviews meeting, but it's also my first time doing the .NET reviews presentation, so I just didn't know
What's expected?
yeah, I wrote down as much as I could, but maybe it's not.
So my first question is like, is all of this API new? Like you have a list of stuff here. Like, is this everything that's new, or is there more stuff? I guess it's new APIs on existing classes, and then you have net new.
Exactly. And then I have lower down, I have the new class.
Okay, that seems like there's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I think you would need to dedicate it its own slot.
And it seems like you also want David or Saurabh to be there.
Yes.
Then let's do that. Needs David Fowler and Saurabh, who I'm sure I spelled incorrectly in my notes, but I autocomplete names because I can barely spell my own name. All right, then let's just walk the backlog at this point. So everything that's blocking is now approved. I just looked at the emails. There was some discussion with Maoni that I think we can conclude as well. And then we're basically left with just the generic backlog of no blocking issues. No, not this one. Which I can't believe I'm living long enough to see that we're actually looking at the backlog.
Yeah, I mean, for the GC info to pull hallway conversation into a stream, I think we should go ahead and just proactively add the GC kind computed property. How do you feel, Steve?
Sorry, my dog's going crazy, so I was on mute. I'm fine with that.
Yeah, I didn't feel strongly enough. Like, it seems useful, but I also would not like force my hand and say it needs to be done in this release. Like, it seems.
Yeah, I just think it's weird that we would add get me the memory info of a kind, and we have get me a memory info, and you and Maoni can tell what kind it was, but no one else can.
Yeah, I mean the computation doesn't seem crazy, but yeah, it's also probably not what you would consider intuitive.
And having it as a computed property means that we're responsible for knowing when to update it instead of be like, oh, well, there's now this new kind of, there's this new enum value, and like you just need to know that when generation is 2 and concurrent is false and this other property returns true, that it meant this other word. So,
right.
So I suggest we add the computed property to Maoni's proposal and then approve that.
Yeah. I think she didn't file the issue for this. I think she just followed up on the existing issue that we already approved, right? So,
right.
That's why I just responded on emailing. All right. So then, I guess here we go. So this is all this to-do list. So let's just open 3, and that's probably all we can ever get to, anyways. Filed by Ryan Grunkemeyer. So. In the year 2015, so we're only 5 years late to this. I think we already kind of do that. Like, we basically try to do TimeSpan everywhere, but like, I don't think we have ever done a pass. So when was this marked API ready for review? So Joe marked it, but where's the actual API proposal?
Because you blessed it. The API proposal, I guess, is everything here in green.
Let me just copy paste this guy.
The one immediate thing that stands out as a problem is granularity might be an issue.
Granularity of
timespan,
you mean resolution of the time span?
Yeah, because timespan itself is good to 100 nanosecond intervals, but the things that it's binding to are probably only good to the second or millisecond level at best. Not a deal breaker, but something to be aware of.
Right. I mean, they can decide that they're going to do, instead of truncating cast, that they can do the ceiling cast. And
yeah.
So you asked for a millisecond plus 100 nanoseconds, so that's 2 milliseconds.
Yeah, but now that means that we have to do a judgment call on every single place where this API is being added.
Right.
I mean, yeah. For the ones that it's used as input, some of the ones that I think it's output or a property.
Oh yeah, that's straightforward.
I guess so the problem with something like regular expression attribute, I guess, is, are we? So let's pretend that one wasn't an attribute. Are we trying to keep the properties in sync? Because we have a guideline, like all guidelines, there are people who break it. We have a guideline that says don't recompute one property based on another. But do we want to say that we want this one to be an exception and they do keep each other in sync?
I would assume, otherwise it wouldn't make sense.
How do you feel, Christoph?
I'm with Levi. We either don't do it or we have to do this weird thing.
I can agree with that as well. Just we have a thing that says don't do it, so I'm making sure that we're comfortable with understanding the reason behind the rule and ignoring it here. So,
by the way, additional issue I'm sure some of you are aware of with timeouts as time spans. People have a problem we've seen in usability studies, and I talked to Steve about it. People don't understand how to specify infinite timeout because they are looking for timespan.infinite, and it's not there.
Oh, we didn't add it, right?
Well, we have a type called infinite timeout, I think, if I remember correctly, but nobody finds it.
Yeah, we have timeout.infinite timespan.
Yeah, and then nobody finds it, and and they get confused. So that's a bit of an issue. And if I remember correctly, we cannot fix it for some reason that I don't remember the reason. I just remember we cannot add infinite timeout to timespan or infinite. I don't know.
I mean, we could add it in 5, but we can't add it in like standard.
No. I think I remember the issue. There's already property called infinite on time span, but it's not what we can use as a infinite timeout. And then we didn't want to add a separate property called infinite timeout to timespan.
Right. There's a timeout.infinite timespan. The request was to add a timespan.infinite and our infinite timeout or something like that, and we couldn't come up with a good way to do it.
Yeah. Also because most people would probably pass timespan.max value and then wonder why they're getting exceptions.
Yeah. Right. So presume, like, I don't know if that means we want to maybe we want to take on the timeout class and add a conversion method that takes time spans and produces the milliseconds. Where, yes, it sounds obvious, but it would handle timespan.max value goes to timeout.infinite, and I mean, it's only like 4 lines of code, but let's put the 4 lines of code in one place and let everybody use it.
Are there particular APIs proposed here that are pain points for people, places where people have really, really wanted TimeSpan for a while?
I don't think so. I think the based on the thread as I read it, we basically said like this needs to be actionable, so please do a scan over the BCL and propose actual APIs, and this is what Reflectronic did. And so he basically just said, here's all the things I found, and then he bucketed into, here's things that I think are straightforward, here are things that are hard, and here's things where we have to really think about how to do it. And so these are the things that he thought was easy, and then here's basically, so here's a bunch of properties, so not sure how to round trip them. And then he said, well, this one uses a different resolution, so I'm not sure how to do them. And then he also added some markers like, you know, this should be a dim and other stuff. So like it's I think as actionable as we can get it. I think if you want to collect more data on what is actually pain points to people, maybe, but I think there might be more work to just walk the list and call it a day.
No, the stuff that's in the front of the list, I think, is actually pretty actionable by us. I think I saw a call to like system.timers.timer in there somewhere, and like stuff like that. I would imagine we would just say like no more changes to system.timers. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, also keep in mind that this comment is like probably at least a few years old at this point, so I'm sure there might be more APIs now. But
I bet that first part's actionable by us. I bet we could do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can
There's
do.
no cheese in my crackers.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we can do most of them. The question is just whether we want, right? And then also the relative value, right? Like my personal gut feel is like there's nothing wrong with these exercises. It's just for my taste, the pay for play isn't quite there, right? Like, you know, Brian raised this concern, but then the question really boils down to like, okay, is this just a few APIs you actually hit day to day where we can just do the 3 APIs and then we get the maximum bang for the buck? Because realistically, like, you know, we can always clean up the BCL, right? Considering the amount of APIs we have. Yeah. So I would just do them when we stumble over them and then, you know, fix them one at a time. Because realistically, we don't have to fix them all, right? And some of them will be harder, right. And then it's just like, well, how much time do we spend on some API that maybe nobody ever will call?
Sure, and that makes sense. I wonder if there's a way to go through APIs of .NET and look for parameters or properties that are called timeout and taken as int, and then say like, okay, maybe the top 20 of these are candidates for changing.
By usage?
By usage, yeah.
Yeah, that wouldn't be hard.
Like intersect it with the list we're given here and then see what falls out.
I'll even go a step further and say all the simple ones I would just do, because if I do 1 or 10 doesn't make a difference. All the ones that require thinking, I would basically say like, well, unless somebody finds a bug, I wouldn't even tackle it.
Okay.
Like this one seems interesting, but also like, is it worth it? I mean, Stream already suffers from too many APIs. I mean, because duplication has its own problems, right? I mean, now having 2 properties, one in milliseconds, one the other in timestamp, is like, sure, we could hide one of them, but then, yeah. Sometimes you just have to accept the fact that you designed a bad API in V1.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that we probably should consider a static method on timeout for turning the timespan.max value and timeout.infinite timespan both into the infinite timeout, and then maybe it gets the opinionated, it uses total milliseconds or ceiling of total milliseconds instead of floor of total milliseconds, and whatever sort of default policy we think that we want to build in, so that any of these that we add that are deferring to millisecond ones, we just say, fine, call timeout.timespan to milliseconds and call the other guy.
That makes sense. Let me actually search for this guy then. I think we talked about this, right? There was a thread.
Yeah, the thing is that people just don't find timeout. Nobody knows that this type exists.
Yeah, but I think that if we're going through and we're going to add the same if timeout is 0 or it's timeout.infinite timespan or it's timeout.max value, then be -1. Otherwise, take total milliseconds and take the ceiling of that, or take total milliseconds and truncate it. Like it's a couple lines of code that we're going to do in a couple places, and at least we can put the utility method that says this is the policy we're doing anywhere that it's duplicated.
Do people right now tend to hard code the literal -1 at call sites rather than using timeout on infinite because it's so undiscoverable? This is for APIs that take an int timeout, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I've used timeout.infinite before just to avoid the magic number problem.
So what I've seen people do is, because if it's an int, you can define a constant. They will define a constant that is actually named and then default to the constant value.
Okay.
So another thing, like we cannot make timespan. Timespan cannot be a const, correct?
Correct.
Not correct. Yeah.
Even now with all these features to ensure immutability.
Well, I mean, you can't bake it into metadata.
Yeah, I mean, you're saying it would be a runtime feature because I assume now that we can ensure instances values being immutable. We could metadata, we would bake along and then, treat it as a long in metadata. But I think still it requires lots of tricky features both in the compiler and the runtime, maybe.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, decimal is a constant. There are air quotes for people who can't see the camera.
I know it has a literal syntax. Can it be used as a const field?
Yes. And the compiler treats it specially.
But the runtime doesn't understand it.
Well, the runtime consts are kind of funny in the runtime. The runtime doesn't care. Like you can specify literally whatever you want to as a constant in the runtime. And it's it just bit bangs stuff into whatever type you need it to get represented as when you pull it back out.
Fair enough. All right, so what are we saying for this issue? That we want to do it, we want to not do it by policy, we want to case by case?
Honestly, like I'm at the point where I think we have an actionable thing here, so we can decide that we approve it and then say file individual PRs and then see how it goes and then mark it up for grabs. I mean, in practice, I think if the work item here is just should we do it, I think the answer is yes, and we already have guidance that says we should be doing it. So in that sense, I think it's relatively clear how the pattern would be. The problem is only that in the particular context of an API, the question is, well, what is resolution of the timer and what are we doing with properties versus methods, right? And I think what I would probably approve here is just if there is a method that takes an int, adding an overload that takes a time span seems very straightforward. Any other pattern, like where we have properties, for example, I would probably just table or even can. And say, is it really worth it to expose another property that just grabs the milliseconds or the seconds? That seems probably worse than just not doing it at all.
I just want to make sure I understand what you're suggesting about. You're suggesting that any PR that is submitted that adds an overload of an existing API where the existing API has an int and the new overload has a time span is blanket approved?
Yes, unless somebody can point out that there's subtle behavior issues, but they're probably not API related, right? They're probably like, oh, you have to actually know the implementation. So basically what I'm suggesting is if you take this list here, this is basically that list, right? So I would just say, I would approve this list here until proven that this is not workable. And then effectively say, I would not approve these guys here because they seem to be more problematic than they're adding. And then for the same reason, I would not just
members, okay.
Yeah.
So add overloads of existing methods, don't really add new members.
Yes.
And whether the actual behavior of the API that's being added, whether it rounds down, rounds up, has some weird error handling, has to be on a case-by-case basis.
Yes.
Okay.
Seems
So,
reasonable.
I mean, the question on that one, just like I'm fine with no. I'm just making sure that we've decided no. That we do think case-by-case evaluation of how the time span's handled is better than trying to do a public utility method on timeout.
I think we need.
I'm not entirely clear what you mean, but I mean, it should pretty much always be the same. It's you get the value from the time span, you check it against the bounds, and you call the one that takes the int.
Right.
Yeah. And okay. So yeah, if we're gonna do the same thing everywhere, then I think that the first such PR sort of has the onus of making timeout dot time span to milliseconds.
Yeah.
As public or internal?
As public.
Right, well, that should be designed then.
Yeah, I think that seems like, yeah, I think we need design for that, but I think that seems to me like it's a very straightforward thing. I would not even use public in an API for that. I would just say that's the behavior you have. Like
Okay, I mean, like it's a couple special cases and then a rounding decision. So
Right.
There is policy in it, which is.
But to me, that's like bounce checking, right? We don't have an API for bounce checking either, right?
No, but it would be easier if we didn't have to make sure that, like, oh, did you use less than or equal to, every single time a review like this comes in. Just say, call the helper method, wash your hands.
Sure. Like, I'm okay with that. If you guys feel strongly that there needs to be an API, then I agree with Steve and bring the API to the review, decide which type this guy lives on. Having helper method on time spent doesn't seem outrageous to me, depending on how it is. And then
I was going to put it
internal for now and shove it in shared source.
Yeah.
On timeout, so it links the two, the time span and the int together. But,
yeah.
Well, what if we just made it internal, put it in shared source, and made it public at some point in the future? That way we unblock it.
that's fine.
That works, but that's again, that to me is implementation decisions on.
Yeah.
Yep.
It just means we get to defer the decision of making a new public API.
Right.
Okay. And then just to clarify, we're saying that if any of the methods that take a time span as an int are virtual, we're saying that the override should be non-virtual and called virtual because changing virtual interweaves is a pain in the butt.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so that means we're happy to.
Glancing at the thing, I didn't see the word virtual on any of the ones where the time span was proposed as an input or input parameter to a method, and so that's probably fine. I'm just like that's the edge case. There is, do we copy the virtual keyword or not? And I like the answer being no.
No, we shouldn't. The only other thing that's the problem is if you're delegating to an existing method and using this helper, will the helper throw an exception that the existing method would not have thrown? But whatever.
Yeah, but that's just API docs of what exceptions the time span throws versus the int one throws.
Yeah. Well, maybe the implementation of the int-consuming method doesn't even look at the int in certain circumstances, so it never validates the parameter. But now if you have a helper method that calls it, the parameter always gets validated.
Yeah. In most of these APIs, the int one checks that it's -1 or greater, and the time span one checks that it fits within an int and is -1 or greater.
Yeah. That makes sense.
So we're out of time, but what did we conclude with the... So I just linked this issue here as well. Just scroll down. Dum, 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 dum. So I just linked this group here. So this was the issue that we discussed earlier, which is the whole timeout situation. The proposal... Sorry,
to
what?
not have time span infinite because we already had timeout infinite time span.
Right. So basically, this was the issue that Christopher brought up, right? That people can't find it, right? This was the proposal that we had. I put another spin on it to say infinite timeout, so that it's clear that it's not an arbitrary infinite value, because there was this concern that they're not the same thing, right? Because the infinite timeout effectively is -1, and that's very specific to the way threading timeouts work. But it's not an infinite time span, right? Concept-wise, but we closed it because we couldn't agree on the shape and we didn't feel like it was important enough. Should we open this, or should we just say, yeah, we're not doing this?
I think we should say we're not doing this.
I'm fine with that.
Not doing things is easy.
I mean, unless someone has a brainstorm that addresses all the issues called out in the thread, but I'm not hearing any new information.
I mean, there is still something to the point Christoph brought up earlier, where apparently this is a bit of failure for people discovering the equivalent of time spent on infinite.
That's fine, but I think that, so.
Yeah, I think we'd be introducing a new bit of failure. That time span dot infinite is -1.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if we did it, I think we'd be exactly at where we were on, looks like September 3rd of Emo suggested infinite timeout. Steve says, I don't love it or think it's necessary, but it needs to be, if we add it, it needs to be super clear. It's this exact number. It's the same as timeout.infinite time span, etc. So I don't think we have any data that says it's changed other than we're adding these new APIs. And if somebody wants infinite timeout and they can't figure out how to do it with the time span, they can call the int one and pass timeout.infinite timeout, or timeout.infinite.
Yeah, which just strikes me as a failure of API design.
Well, I agree with that, but I think that's it goes back to like what's worse, right? I mean, another option that we have is, Stephen kind of hinted at this, but having used ReSharper for a while, they had this thing called smart completion. So you could imagine that when you open up an API and you pass in an argument that is marked time span, that autocomplete suggests timeout.infinite time span, right? Like that's not outrageous, right? Like, and I think that's kind of within the spirit of what this thing would fix, right? It's really about the discoverability more than anything. And then the question is it worth it?
It requires an API change. Yeah, we definitely shouldn't address it at the API level. It would just be nice if the IDE would help people along, since it seems like we have evidence that people are tripping up here.
Right. But then also don't have enough data. Maybe we'll need to pass in the timeout, right? Like that seems also somewhat of a more advanced scenario. It doesn't strike me as a initial scenario. All right, so then this is all we had, and then I will set up dedicated reviews next week, I think, for the big 3 items that we have. Volume 1 will probably take an hour, would be my guess, based on what I just saw from Miriam. And then the first 2 probably don't take more than an hour combined, so we can probably say that we do 3 issues next Tuesday, and then we should be good with blocking ones for now. Anything else? Sweet, then have a great weekend, and then I'll see you next week.
You too.